Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today we're going to be doing part 2 of my review and tier list of every single opening week USFL and XFL 3.0 game. I did this a couple months ago for the XFL, and as well as putting the USFL games last year on it. This is going to be a tier list where I put every single opening week game, the games that are supposed to entice the fans to keep watching and get you hooked in the league. And so, without further ado, let's get started with this week. So, in terms of the tier list, as you can see, we have S, A, B, C, D, and F. F are for terrible games that overall are never going to be remembered. D are for overall bad games with some memory. C are for just your average football game, one that wasn't a pain to watch, one that was fun to watch, but you probably won't remember a ton of it. B is for those games that were a bit better than C. They have some memorable moments or were close for a while, but aren't ones that you're going to remember 10 years from now. A tier are for really solid games that are fun to watch, great overall. And then S tier is going to be those top of the line, incredible games that there's almost no real flaws about. So without further ado, let's get started with the Philadelphia Stars at the Memphis Showboats. This game was one that a lot of people thought the Stars were going to easily win and just come in and blow out the Showboats. That wasn't fully the case. The Showboats were able to put up a really good fight and ended up only losing by 4 in a very close game. It was an incredible game, had a great atmosphere at the Memphis's Simons Bank Liberty Stadium, and it was overall a great game. Now, I will say this. I'm not going to put it in S tier. I think some people might say that this one was good enough to be up there, but I'm not. Now, while there were some great plays in all this, there were some great defensive plays, there were some great special teams moments, as you had multiple kicks that ended up getting blocked or missed from the Showboats that ended up harming them in the end. I think the big thing is the fact that the Stars, let's just say, there were a couple issues with penalties. There were a lot of penalties, and I think that's the issue I have here. It's just, I don't know. The fact of how they worked, it just was kind of off to me. There was a lot of penalties that hit the Stars, especially at the end of Memphis's iconic touchdown drive at the beginning of the fourth quarter. They had this 7.5 minute drive that resulted in a touchdown, and it only really became a touchdown because there were multiple Stars penalties. Now, I know some people might say that, penalties aren't the biggest deal or something like that, but I think when you're seeing constant penalties on a single drive, it kind of devalues the other team's offense, and in this case, it devalues the Showboats offense, as the Stars kept on hitting themselves in the foot in that goal line stand. And then you had the kicker for the Showboats missed the extra point, which hindered them on their last drive, where they were forced to score a touchdown, and overall, it just hurt. But I think that overall this game was still a very great game. There were some great moments, having great special teams and all that kind of stuff is always a cool thing. But I think that overall it was still a really solid game. And, it was definitely a great game, but not one I would put in S tier. So I'm going to put this in A tier. I think this game was a truly great game. It was a great opening game again. And the fact is that this was a game that I think was a lot closer than most people thought. It's just that this game lacked the overall quality to go to S tier due to the penalties really affecting the Stars throughout the game, especially at that touchdown drive for the Showboats. It just felt that if it wasn't for, self-inflicted wounds, the Stars would have been able to win this a bit more cleanly instead of having to just barely eke out a win, as the whole game was the Showboats trying to come back at the Stars. Still a great game, but just not one that I would say is S tier quality. Then we have the second game being the rematch of last year's opening game in the Generals versus the Stallions. This game's first half was awesome. The first quarter was decent. There was, naturally some problems with it in the end, as, there wasn't really any scoring in the first quarter. But it was still until, a bit through the end of it. But it was still a really incredible first quarter and all that. And then the second quarter was really great. Really, the second quarter was the huge win for this game. The second quarter had a ton of action. You had touchdowns, you had field goals, you had turnovers on downs. It was just incredible how this whole second quarter was. And I think that overall, that second quarter, beginning of third quarter, and end of first quarter are enough to keep this game at the minimum of a C tier. Now, where else would I put this game? I don't know. The fact is that this game, despite the fact that the Stallions had a basically huge lead throughout most of the game after the midway through the third quarter, the game still felt like the Generals were in reach of it. They never really played terrible enough for you to say they're out of it. In the first drive, fourth quarter, one of their first drives, they ended up taking off 5 minutes of the clock and they got pretty far down the field. But when they went for it on their fourth down, they ended up failing it. So if they don't, miss that game is a lot closer than it was. So the fact is that this game didn't become a true blowout till I would say after the turnover on downs in the fourth quarter. So I think that overall, with how great the second and beginning of the third quarter was, and how the Generals were still able to come within reach, I think this was a B tier game. I think this game was slightly better than an average game, but definitely is not an A tier game, and definitely does not match the classic they had last year, just due to the fact that it was more of a blowout for the most part. But I think B tier is a solid place for this game. Overall, it was still a solid game, but not nearly as great as last year's. Then we have the Panthers versus the Gamblers, and let's just look at it for what it is. This game was, again, it was really great until you got about to the fourth quarter. So, once you go through the first three quarters, they were all very close, tight-knit game. You had a bunch of wounds that some were inflicted by themselves, and some weren't. Essentially, you had the Gamblers who were either able to score touchdowns or felt like they were turning the ball over. In the third quarter, they had two separate turnovers, and those both ended up, and one of them ended up helping the Panthers score. And then the game was still close heading into the fourth quarter as well, but then you had another fumble by the Gamblers close to the end of the game, and that's what ended up really costing them. If they don't fumble that ball there's a good chance that this game could have gone to OT and stuff like that. It was definitely a close game and not one that you can really, put down into like a C, D, or F tier because of the fact that it was close for all until the last 5 minutes. But there's no real memorable or great moment or overall quality for me to put this in A tier. I think this was a solid game. Josh Love for the Panthers had an outstanding day that we'll talk about more in the week review and, the power rankings. But it was still an overall solid game. Definitely a good one. I would put this at B tier again. It was close for the most part, had some great moments, but there was a bit of a huge amount of punting compared to the Stallions Generals game. And the fact is that there were a lot of turnovers by the Gamblers. And it felt that the Panthers should have taken the lead farther than they ended up doing it. But I think B tier is solid for this game. And then last, we have the Maulers versus the Breakers. I don't think many people besides myself saw this as a close game, but it was. This game really shocked me as being one of the best games of the opening week. I wouldn't say it was as good as the Memphis and Philly game, but it was still a really great game. You had a bunch of trading field goals where it felt like this was a battle for inches type of game, where even though there were a lot of punts, it wasn't like the punt fest of the Bandits versus Maulers last year, where that game kind of just felt really, really, really boring, where it was just, oh my gosh. If you remember that game was just, it was a blowout that felt really boring. This one wasn't like that. This one was one where the punting felt like it mattered because you were battling for inches. You needed anything you could get. That's what made it great, was that any little thing you got was a huge deal. And that's why whenever you had blocked kicks, as you had at the end of the half, the Maulers were going for a field goal, which would have given them the lead, and it ends up getting blocked, and that was a huge deal. Because that's 3 points that you're now missing. You had fumbles, turnovers that mattered. Everything just seemed to matter because, it was a great game. And I think that, you had a fumble that was recovered for a touchdown by the Maulers, then you had the field goal or the PAT, oh my gosh. It was a great game. The ending was truly great. You're thinking for the most part of the end, you're thinking the Breakers are going to win this because the Mahler special teams had completely flopped at that point. You had failed a 2-point conversion, you had kicks blocked, you had missed stuff. It felt that the Mahler special teams was just done. But then you have the Breakers just punt the ball, and all of a sudden, the Maulers have the tie game. The Maulers get a return touchdown of an 82-yard return, and then they miss the extra point again. And then the Breakers are able to score the touchdown that ends up being the dagger. This game had no right to be as good as it was. It felt overall the sloppiest of all of them, which was to be expected. You had the two teams with first-year head coaches, as well as not really any returning quarterbacks. Yet it somehow was this tight-knit game throughout, where even though you always felt that the Breakers were the better team, there was something that Maulers did or had that would push them over the edge. Overall, this was a great game. It goes into A tier. It was a really solid one that came out of nowhere. It was a great game. Now, in terms of how the overall week did and the tier list wakes out, this week was the best first week across, well, all three iterations. The first year, last year, the USFL, and the opening week this year, the XFL. And that, to me, is something that was to be expected. The quality of play was definitely far better than the XFL week 1 or USFL week 1 last year, as you had a lot of guys come back, so you had that team cohesion. But the quality of the game and the overall games themselves, that one you can't really say for sure are still going to be great, even if there's, better quality. Yet, they ended up being really solid. There wasn't any bad game this year. There wasn't any Bandits Maulers game that was just horrific or any just average game like the Breakers Stars last year. Instead, every game was at least solid. And I think that was definitely a really good thing for the league to have that happen in opening week. So we'll see some stuff happen. Tomorrow, the Power Rankings video should be out. This has been Zom Fox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. And as always, have a great night.